just wanted to welcome you all back to the iLab for the fourth in our five-part series with Michael Skok this evening on Startup Secrets. Tonight we're going to talk about going to market. With that, I'd like to welcome Michael back for this evening's presentation, Going to Market.
Thanks very much, Neil. Well, good evening, everybody. It's tough to compete with pizza, but I'll try to get us going on the agenda this evening. I want to first of all take a moment to say that this subject is probably one which in of itself could be 5 parts. And so to set your expectations, we are going to cover a very few pieces of what might make up a marketing strategy or set of tactics that you would think about. But in framing it, I was lucky enough to have a great number of portfolio companies to choose from. And I want to introduce you to the 2 companies that are here tonight that are kind enough to participate in the case study, as well as Adam Berry, who's an executive in residence with me, who himself is a very well-known marketer in the startup world. So if I could just do this by having you guys stand up. First of all, we have Jameis from Demandware. And Jameis is our CMO. He's going to talk a little bit about their case study. And we have Brian and Tom from Unidesk. Thank you guys very much for joining. And then Adam in the back, Adam Berry. So hopefully you will all get a chance to meet them, because actually everything I say is irrelevant compared to the fact that these guys go make this work day to day and get paid to do that. So it's just a pleasure to have them here tonight, and I think we'll get a lot out of them. So as Neil was saying, this is part 4 of the 5-part series. And because a number of you have been here before, I'm going to try to stitch together the 3 other pieces that have gone before. For those of you that aren't familiar with those 3 pieces, I've also put in some recaps to try to at least bring it together. It does mean that unlike the first couple of series, there's a lot of material here. And I'll tell you right off the bat, if we go back one slide, it's impossible for it all to be in detail here. So if you want to look at this, you can find it on mjskok.com. That's been simplified as a place for you to go find each of these places. And Harvard has worked with me to put the slides up there, and we're going to be getting the videos up there in due course. So if you don't find all the detail that you're looking for as we go through this, or if you've missed some of the previous sessions, trust me, you'll find it up on the web and you'll be able to get more behind it. So with that, let's get into the meat of this. I'm going to build a framework for you here, which in of itself is, I think, something you can use. And the way to think about this framework is that you're going to have a series of steps in your sales cycle that will take you from engaging with a customer, or them finding you, all the way down to them buying your software or hardware or whatever it is you're selling. And you're going to want to get to that audience via some strategies and tactics and through whatever channel. And we'll talk more about what the audience is and how important it is to identify that audience and segment it. And throughout this, I'm going to try to identify for you some of the results that you're going to want to track along the way, the metrics you'll use to do that. And in the end, I'll say the obvious, which is that this is all about execution. However, if you don't know where you're headed, any road will get you there. And so that's why strategy is so important up front. And then the tactics employed are obviously going to be at least a piece of what you want to focus on as a startup. And for the 3 that we've picked, we've tried to pick a mix between strategy in brand and positioning and tactics in things like how you would go to market either directly or indirectly through a channel. And then in particular, where would you focus your energies? What targeting and segmenting. That's not to say these are the top 3 or the only 3. There are many things, as I said, that we just won't get time to cover tonight. But I'll try to actually flesh these out in time, either in other workshops or in articles on the web for you. So let's get started by talking about positioning. Positioning is an interesting subject because oftentimes people think it's a science, but in reality, if I said to you, where would you position Apple? You'd all have an answer to that, but it would probably have a position in your mind that's different to the next person's. Obviously, you want all of these people to be as similarly viewing you and your brand and how you're positioned. And that's the idea behind getting a good positioning statement. It's occupying a distinct place in your customers' minds, and hopefully on a consistent basis. I also add one piece to it, which I think is important, which is, as a startup, you obviously don't want to go and compete where there are 50 other players. And so you're trying to position yourself for a unique white space where you can own some segment of the market. And that's why when we talk about segmenting, you'll understand that it's important to try to identify that segment as small as possible so you can be realistic about how you'd apply your resources to it. Now, again, I mentioned some of you have already seen this. For those of you that haven't, in the first workshop on value prop, we talked about how do you define your value prop, and we used this framework for target customers who are dissatisfied with, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not going to go over all of this again tonight because obviously we covered it in the value prop. A lot of you built it in that session. But the good news is for those of you who were here for that, it's exactly the same framework for positioning, and I intentionally built it in a simplified sense to start off with so it would make it easy for you to move to positioning. The thing that's different to what we talked about in the value prop is really these three areas: segmentation, differentiation, and whole product, which Jameis is going to cover for you a little later on. What I'd like to do to start off with is take that competition piece and help what I think is a challenge for most startups, which is for people to define what they do uniquely well. And I often say that the problem here is people's invention is almost invariably at the forefront of their mind, so they're excited by talking about it in technology terms. That's great, and it's certainly a starting point, but an important part of this is it's not just the technology. In fact, if you were to find, for example, a unique targeted white space, a segment that nobody else had adopted, that might be your differentiation, that you're targeting some market that nobody's ever gone after before in a way, perhaps with go-to-market approaches that we're going to talk about tonight, or a business model that we've talked about before that's differentiated. So don't just think about your differentiation in terms of technology. Think about the segment, the business model, the approach that you take to that market, et cetera, as ways you can differentiate. The next key thing is, obviously you're going to come up against competitors who are much bigger than you, or they may already be there in some regard or another, and in which case what you're trying to do is put barriers to them entering the white space that you find, or following your approach and taking a lead after you because they've got more resource. So again, one of the things Harvard people I'm sure are very familiar with is the great work that was done in the Innovator's Dilemma. That's an example of how a business model can actually cause somebody who's an existing player not to be able to follow you because you're attacking, in many instances, the soft underbelly of perhaps the way they've priced or positioned in a marketplace. So a barrier to entry is often not technology again. It's often things like business model or, again, maybe your go-to-market approach. So again, I encourage you to think about those. And then the third thing is really what makes this sustainable? Because you might initially have a winning strategy to defend some white space, but then how do you keep that? Now, what I'll typically hear is IP. Obviously, if you've got great technology, that's a great starting point. Patents around that can be great, but by the way, there's a double-edged sword there because oftentimes patents, of course, expose your method or apparatus or process. But one of the things we talked about, if you remember, in the business model is that there are other things that can be very defensible and sustainable for you, like the network. If you're Facebook, your network is worth more than anything today. Or if you're an ad network, perhaps it's your data. Or it may be your process if you've got some clever approach to, for example, building a product or delivering a service. All of those things should be thought of as how you'll build the sustainable positioning in the competition. Now, for those of you who've got to see some of the presentation, I'm a big believer in trying to find a way to actually picture these things. And so this is really all about building some kind of a chart of what capabilities you have that are differentiated versus the competitors. And I'm just showing the competitors here as A, B, C, D, just for simplicity. The first step here is to try to think about these guys in terms of their relative size. So you might size those bubbles based on who is the larger player in the marketplace. The second thing is then obviously actually very key to me is defining these axes in a way that sets you up to be in the top right. So for example, you'll typically see people say things like, well, performance is one and price is another. That's a pretty easy starting point. Is it a good one? Anybody here care to comment on that? Price, performance? I mean, how often do you hear that? Probably a lot, right? Anybody think it's a good idea? Too much pizza in the room, definitely. Okay, well, we're not going to use price performance on pizza, but we could say cheese per square centimeter. We could say salami. We could say lots of things. My point is this. When you pick these axes, what you're trying to do is, first of all, position yourself in the top right, and that's to get some white space, where you can uniquely claim that you have the best price performance, we were going to use that, or the best cheese per square centimeter with salami on it. But I'm going to take you one step further, and I'm going to actually try to get you to do the following. It's actually really easy for somebody to come in and compete if all you say is, we put more cheese on our pizzas and salami per square centimeter. Because all they're going to do is, at that point, add more themselves. And if they can find a way to do it as cheaply as you do, frankly, you just lost your competitive positioning. So what you want to try to do is to find some true barriers, as I've put here with the red lines, where people cannot cross from one side to the other. Well, what are examples of real barriers? I'm going to give you a case study tonight about Demandware. Demandware changed the game in e-commerce because up till this point, even if people had better price performance in e-commerce delivery on the web, they were the first guys to deliver it on demand. So there was no infrastructure whatsoever. So this would be on-premise and this would be on demand. People just couldn't cross that barrier by adding more function or performance. They had to rewrite their architectures to be multi-tenant, remote development, scalable, reliable, etc., and many, many other things. And it was literally a barrier to entry for anybody to be able to get into their space to come onto the SaaS side here. I'll let James tell you about the second barrier that they created a little bit later on, but it was not just technology. It became the entire ecosystem around the platform of Demandware that he'll talk about called the Link program. So they are a great example of a company that ended up creating not only an individual white space for themselves, a unique white space, but also some really clear barriers to entry. The first of which was on-demand versus on-premise, and the second of which James is going to talk to you about, which is this complete whole product and solution that they've got in their Link program. So to summarize on this section, I really encourage you not to just look for things that are easy for people to follow you along, but to look for true barriers to entry which differentiate you and that make it very difficult for your competition to follow, based around those 3 points I mentioned. Okay, so that's positioning. I'm now going to ask Adam to come up and join me as I introduce brand. So brand is really a science unto itself, and there are many ways people talk about this, and so I would just simplify it by saying you have to think about what you want to be as a brand in terms of something as simple as who you are. So are you somebody who drinks Coke or Pepsi? Why? What does that represent to you? Well, that's basically an example of the kind of brand that you've got to think about. Do you represent one or the other? In our business, it's probably, are you Dell low-cost provision, or are you Apple, premium best product? And that's really the essence of thinking about how brand might come into play in your go-to-market. The thing I want to share with you as a startup is it can get complicated if you get this initial set of thoughts about, well, how would I define my brand? But it's simple as this to start off with. It's about you. You, the founders, are going to be the brand of your company to start off with. And what you do to engage with your first customers, your first partners, even your shareholders, is going to define what your brand is. And how you execute in literally day-to-day engagement with those people is going to be what people remember you for. So even if you haven't taken time to define your brand, it will be defined by those kinds of behaviors. With that, I'd like Adam to give you some sense of how to bring this into more of a scientific approach. I see you miking up, Adam. Are you ready?
I think so. Can you hear me?
Coming up to the front.
Yeah. I'll start and keep going. So let's talk about brand. Take a moment and think about a brand that you love or a brand that you think is great. And think about what makes it great. Why is that brand so good? All right, who wants to share one of these? Bring it. Okay, stand up, tell us your name, the brand, in one sentence what makes it great. Really loud.
My name is Nazia, and I like Dell. That was my first computer because it was cheap, and I could afford it.
Awesome. All right, somebody else. Share. Don't be shy. You're getting graded on this. Go for it.
I cheated. I saw the sign Coca-Cola. I thought of consistency.
Uh-huh.
It's like wherever you go, it's the same product.
Great. And your name?
Sergio.
All right, one more. Bring it. Go for it.
Fadi. My name is Fadi, and brand I like it's Moleskine. They make great notebooks and pens. And what I like about the brand is the perfectionism in every detail about the quality, even the size of the paper, and
Awesome. That's good. We got it. We got to go fast. So brand's an incredibly powerful tool. If you have a strong brand, it drives sales, it gets you into customers, it opens up new markets for you, it drives top-line revenue, it drives profitability. But what is it? Really, what is a brand? Normally when you think brand, you think immediately of an expression of the brand. So you think about the Nike swoosh, or you think about the iconic grille on the front of a BMW. Maybe you think about the unique service that you can get from a company like Nordstrom, or the sound that you get in a Harley-Davidson motorcycle. All of those are really powerful expressions of brand. But they start from something deeper. They start from a core idea, from a concept. I call that a brand essence. It sits at the center of a brand. And all those other things that surround it, your name, your logo, the graphics that you use on your website, the voice that you have on the voicemail answering machine, the way your website works to service customers, all the ways you touch your customers through your brand, they're fundamentally expressions of that brand essence. And as Michael was saying, that brand essence actually starts with you, the founder, and with the culture of the organization you build around it. If what you're trying to create as a brand is inconsistent with your culture as a company, it will fall apart. It will break as you get more and more people in. It won't be consistent, it won't have integrity, people won't remember it. So how do you define a brand essence? We don't have time for me to go through this all in detail, but I just want to throw out there kind of the core concepts that go into a brand essence. There's basically 4 pieces that you want to work with. So the first is a vision. Now when I talk about a vision, I don't mean a vision for your product roadmap. What I mean is a vision for how the world is going to change, or how the world is changing as a result of your product, or how your product is reacting to that change. So to use Nike as an example, which started all the way back in the 70s, the change that they tackled was the emergence of the amateur athlete and the sort of personal health movement. People wanted to be athletic. So that's the first piece. You have to vision, what is it about the world that you're changing fundamentally? Second thing is you need a promise. In some ways, what a brand really represents is a promise to a consumer or to a customer. To come back to the Nike example, I think Nike's promise is that we will make you and help you perform at your very best. If you wear our shoes, if you wear our gear, you will run as fast as you can, you will jump as high as you can, you will achieve your true potential for performance. So that's your promise. And once you've made that promise, try to keep that everywhere. You try to keep that in every single interaction, every single time. And when you break that promise, you pay for it, because your customers will know right away. The third component are what are called brand attributes. And again, you can think about these conceptually. So they're ideas that underlie all the different expressions that you might have for your brand. And there's 3 levels. The first is your spike. Sometimes people call this one simple thing. It's a single core idea that unifies everything you do. For Zipcar, they call it freedom. I think for Nike, again, it comes back to the idea of performance or technical performance. For Puma, it's probably style. Then there's 3 or 4 attributes that make you special. They're the things that differentiate you, the things that separate you from the pack, that make you something unique in terms of what you do. So Cold Fusion, product that I worked on for building web applications, our key special attribute was speed. You could write applications faster with us than anything else. But we tried to get that idea of speed everywhere. Every transaction with us should be fast, should be simple, should be easy to do. And then you have cost of entry. So that depends on the market. You know, if you're selling cars, it's safety. If you're selling database systems, it's scalability and reliability. There's certain things you have to get in. The final piece of a brand is its personality. So brand isn't just technical, it's emotional. You form a connection with people on an emotional level. So when I'm thinking about this on a conceptual level, I like to express this in terms of a personality. And it ties back to exactly what Michael said, which is you are the brand in your startup. Steve Jobs was Apple. He was literally a manifestation of Apple. The way he dressed, the simplicity, the focus of it, the way he spoke, the way he presented things and invented things as if they were magical. He was the brand. And that very often happens in companies, especially in their first 30 or 40 years before they become really institutionalized. So one way to think about your brand emotionally is to think about the personality. If your brand was a person, what would it be like? What would their personality be like? Would they be friendly? Would they be aggressive, like a Larry Ellison? Would they be super creative? Would they be very flexible and easygoing, super casual? So you think about, would they be fun and playful? Think about their personality, and that'll help you think about how to communicate the emotional aspects of your brand. And then finally, think about your brand style. And again, I like using the metaphor of a person. So what would they wear? How would they look? If you're Chanel, you're super classy. If you're Victoria's Secret, you're kind of sexy, right? If you're Oracle, it's, your sort of style is very stark. And if you're Apple, your style is very elegant. So imagine again a person. What would they wear? How would they look? What would their style be? So brand is this fundamentally powerful thing. Everyone here can immediately think of the brands they connect with. Brand starts with an idea. It starts with a core brand essence. Then you then find different ways to express that idea 360 degrees, everywhere you touch customers. And that brand essence has these sort of 4 basic components. Now, as anyone who knows me well knows, I could go on about this topic for probably another 2.5 or 3 hours before I would need a drink. And then I could keep going. Short of that, given that Michael would be really unhappy were I to go down that road, I am going to write a couple articles about this, which I'm going to put on my website, which I call Startup Blender. So go sign up, and hopefully you'll see an email from me about that. So anyways, a few thoughts on brands. Hopefully it's helpful.
Thank you very much, Adam. I don't know about you, but every time I hear Adam speak, I want to go buy whatever it is he's selling. And I suddenly feel like I should go get a pair of Nike shoes and start running and jumping. But I really connect with the way he's approached that. And so I asked him to share this with you, and he'll put this up on his site too. And there's some things there that I think you can connect back to, hopefully, that we've talked about. Like, for example, culture. We talked about how you build culture and company formation. That connects very much to brand. But just to draw out specifically for tonight, consistency. Great brands are consistent. I think somebody already said that when they were talking about Coke. It was the first thing they thought of. They also represent the values that your company is all about. And again, we talked about that in company formation. And then ultimately, they're reliable. If you're going to trust a brand, it should always keep its promise. It should be consistently delivering on what it's offered. And I decided it would be obvious to pick this, but fun to go to look it out. This is the original Apple marketing philosophy, which, if you can't see it at the back, was January 3rd, 1977 by Mike Markkula, who was brought in as the adult supervision in those days when Jobs was kind of getting the company together. And it really didn't ever change. All this time later, Apple still uses this word, which, by the way, I had to look up, and I think a lot of people probably did, impute, which was this notion that Apple's brand would impute the value of the products, which means represent them immediately. And if you've ever opened up an Apple box, the minute you even touch the box, it starts representing what Apple wants you to feel as its brand. It comes through from the packaging all the way through to the first experience of actually touching the product, to switching it on and then using it. And so I'm going to just leave you with one simple startup secret, and that's at the top here. That is, start how you mean to end, because brands are really, really tough to change. So if you're going to start with a brand with a set of values and principles that you really believe in, just like we said this in culture, it's probably going to last for a long, long time, especially if you want it to and you keep it consistent, then it can keep getting reinforced. So start how you mean to end. Okay, so that's brand. Let's talk about the last piece for tonight on the strategic agenda, and that's targeting and segmentation. This is a really fun way of thinking about this. And that is, what's the perfect startup storm? What's going to get your business just immediately to the front of people's minds? And I would say it's going to be 3 things, actually. It's not just having a great product, a great idea with a breakthrough value prop. It's what we talked about last time. It's also having a disruptive business model that makes it unbelievably easy for people to engage you. And then, this is the third and most important piece for this section, it's finding this new market opportunity where, at this particular point in time, there isn't anybody else addressing this particular area of need. And if you can do that, you're in the perfect storm. You're in a great place to go make an impact. But why also does it make a difference beyond that? Well, people typically think about segmentation as targeting a market. That's important for product market fit. But it's also, if you think about it, important for packaging and distribution. Because if you pick a particular product that's luxury, high value, like Chanel, that you were just hearing from Adam about, it's going to be sold very differently than thinking about something that is a knockoff T-shirt that comes from Taiwan, that doesn't have a brand, that's obviously going to go through mass outlets in retail for just broad reach. So it's actually incredibly important to think about all of the segmentation aspects in terms of all of the ways you'll go to market. And ultimately, everything I would say in marketing depends on getting a good targeting and segmentation. So I'll give you a sense of this using a diagram that I just put up, but that also relate it back to what you probably hear a lot of. In this diagram, what I'm really saying is if you have a value proposition that could apply to this whole marketplace, that's okay. But wouldn't it be better if what you could do is get it really focused on a small segment here where the amount of coverage that you had to have was a lot smaller? So think about that for a second. If your value prop has to reach thousands of people and apply to all of them, it's going to be a lot of work for a startup. But if you could target it down to one person and you could say, oh, I know that person really, really well, and I know exactly what they need, it would be very easy to meet their needs. So somewhere in between is what we're trying to find. And for those of you who weren't here for the value prop session, we talked about a number of things, finding discontinuous, defensible, and disruptive value props. Those are all important. But we also talked about finding people who had needs that were unworkable, unavoidable, and urgent. And we had one under there that is highly relevant to targeting, which is in an underserved market where those needs aren't being met today. I'm going to add one last one, which is, again, this notion of uniqueness. Finding something where you can uniquely serve that need. So now, what we're looking at in this diagram is you've got a unique value proposition that can meet an underserved need. You're going to end up with a very unique, in a unique position as a startup to be successful. Because other people haven't identified that segment, and other people haven't got as focused on it to come up with a unique proposition. You're going to be better set up for success. There are people who obviously have other lingos out there, so I'll use the lean startup lingo, so you might use this if this is more comfortable to you. Most people have heard of the minimum viable product. Actually, let's get a show of hands. Who has heard of MVP? Okay, good. So lots of people are reading that material. Well, minimum viable product's one thing, but as you hear in that discussion of what it takes to build a minimum viable product, again, the same principle applies. If you're trying to meet a minimum viable product for an entire market, that's going to be a much bigger product than if you pick a small segment of it to actually meet the needs. And so again, the smaller the segment you pick, the easier it's going to be for you to successfully cover it with your first minimum viable product. So look for that intersection, and this is why segmentation is so important. Now, what is segmentation? One of the biggest mistakes people make is to just go down what I would describe as the sort of classic thinking of, oh, well, it's pick a vertical. It's finance or it's government. Yeah, that might be one way. But the really key thing to look for is what the customer's needs are and lining those up and finding ultimately a segment according to a customer set of needs that are consistent from customer to customer in this particular segment. Why that's so important is that if you can find 5 customers who have exactly the same need, that to me is a great segment. Why? Because if you hit the first guy, you know you're going to get the next 4. And then this comes into play, which is incredibly important. As you know, I'm a student of Geoffrey Moore. You'll be here for the end. He talks about this almost religiously through his book. Once that first customer is met, has had their needs met, if they happen to know the next guy, in fact, if they're sitting right next to them, guess what they're going to want to do? They're going to want to reinforce that they bought a great product to their friend. And so they're going to reference each other. And then both of them are now talking about it, and the guy next to him is going to get infected by that enthusiasm. The next thing you know, he buys. And this is the whole point about reference selling. But you can't reference sell if you didn't segment up front with people who have consistent needs. Because if the guy sitting next to you has got completely different needs, you can go on and on and on about how the fact is you absolutely love these Nike sneakers, but the guy happens to like skiing, and he doesn't run because he's got some kind of a problem with his back. Not going to work. It's just not the same problem set. So segmentation is incredibly important for these 2 reasons. And ultimately, if you do it right, it leads to you dominating a segment which Geoffrey will typically talk about as a beachhead. And that initial beachhead is incredibly important because once you win a beachhead, once you win that initial segment, you can declare victory. You can say, we are the leader in providing sportswear for the amateur runner, et cetera, et cetera. And that point obviously becomes reinforcing of your brand and many other things we're going to talk about. So this is why segmentation is so important. It's particularly important for startups because you don't have the resource to compete broadly. So you're going to have to compete in a very focused way. So here's the mistake I want you to avoid. You'll often hear people tell you, I hate to say it, I hear it from other people in the boardroom too often, oh, go vertical. You know, pick automotive or financial services or government. Well, by the way, those aren't verticals in my opinion. Financial services is a whole bunch of verticals, insurance, banking, etc. But even if you get that right, people then say, oh, just pick size. You know, are you going after consumer, SMB, or enterprise? Those may be attributes that are important. But what I'm really trying to tell you to do is to go way beyond that and drill down to where there are problems and needs that are consistent. So for example, if you can find a process like regulatory approval, it might work across many different verticals. Pharma, financial services, government, they all have regulatory approval. They all need it. So sometimes people talk about this as a diagonal way to segment a marketplace. In other words, you can go across verticals, but with a single problem set where you're meeting consistent needs. My point here is it's about the needs. It's about finding a way to get them really clearly identified at the center of what your value prop is that you're addressing. Okay, so the next challenge I've often heard from people is, okay, we can find needs that are consistent. If you remember the value prop, what I tried to get people to understand was the significance of finding something that's urgent and critical. So here's an example for you to get a sense of this. Mobile is hot right now, so I get probably, not an exaggeration, you know, a dozen or so mobile business plans a month. And you'd be amazed what I hear, which is, oh yeah, we've got a market, it's the mobile professional market. Okay. How big is the mobile professional market? I think it's probably pretty much as big as the market in general these days, because everybody would describe themselves in probably some industry or other as a mobile professional. Okay, so let's drill down on that. We could look just at say, well, maybe it's office workers. But I'm going to try to get you to see how if you get to think about this and double click on it, you can actually get to a really interesting market segment. So we could drill down and say, well, let's go after field workers versus white collar workers. We could say, let's go after services people rather than salespeople. All these people are mobile professionals, by the way. And then let's pick a segment where they might have a real pain point, like medical equipment. So servicing medical equipment rather than just office equipment. And then, and by the way, just to pause on that, so this would be, as an example, Pitney Bowes, and this would be Agilent, you know, to give you a sense of the way companies might fall into these things. And then if you're servicing medical equipment, why go after medical clinics if you could go after hospitals where you're not just dealing with a diagnostic problem, but you're dealing with critical care where lives are at stake? Now if you start to think about this, I'm able to say, if I can segment all the way down to this and identify, and I haven't gone into this full length of detail, but a set of well-defined similar needs where we solve critical care problems by enabling hospitals who need medical equipment 24/7 to work and provide the services people in the field with a solution that is mobile, okay, now I probably am doing something really valuable, really well focused, and actually for a segment where if I can get those needs aligned, you'll have some real referenceability. Because you start saving lives for hospitals, people will talk about it. So that's the way to think about segmentation. There are many examples we could work through in the workshop, and I hope you'll get a chance this evening to engage us on these examples. My last but most critical thing that I actually am going to say a prayer for is that each and every one of you, when you start your company, has the patience with yourself to work through focusing on what that segment is. My single biggest challenge, literally, with startups is that they try to do too much. In general, that's true. And as a startup, the challenge is almost invariably focus, just one word, focus on what you can do uniquely well for who. And that starts with this segmentation that we've just been talking about. It also leads to, as I've just mentioned, the ability to create this beachhead where you can win. So I'm going to try to get you to answer a question. in your minds to realize this. And every time you're stuck making a decision as a startup, I'd encourage you to ask this question. How could you focus? And in the end, which would you rather? Would you rather expand on success or contract on failure? That's the question I want you to ask yourself every time you're at a junction about whether you should go big or get focused. Because I'll tell you what I see as the number one problem in startups. People try to do too much too soon, they end up doing none of it well, and they end up having to contract on failure, as opposed to the really good ones where people start with an incredibly small segment with a very focused minimum viable product. They meet that need uniquely well, and then even if it's only for one customer, they build on it and they get the next customer successful, and they reference that one, they get the next one successful. So it's my wish, my hope, and even my prayer for you that you find your focus and you figure out how to build on that to get your success going. Okay, enough from me on segmentation. What I'd like to do now is introduce Demandware and Jameis, who lived this for real as a business building an opportunity, which is huge, going after the massive e-commerce market. Jameis, how did you segment?
So we were thinking through, as Michael said, a very, very large market, e-commerce, selling online. Who doesn't want to do it, right? Thousands and thousands of entities in North America alone who want to do it. And we were, at the time, about 22 people. So we started off with the concept of how do we really focus in on a place where we can win? We had a couple of guiding principles. One was get small, get big, or get out. The idea there being pick an area where it was really small and discrete and get really big within that niche. Or, if you couldn't do that, then move on to another niche. But the idea was pick an area where we could win and serve the market distinctly. Find a market that was small enough to be actionable. So to the concept of reference selling, find an area where everybody knew everybody else. It was small enough at the size of company we were to really get in there and do something great. But it was large enough that if we won, it was a meaningful enough company. And think about the questions about could we deliver in there with distinction? And if we succeeded, ultimately, would anybody care? Right? So it's one thing to win a niche, but would that niche open up other niches for you? So what we did is we thought about not just even verticalized segments, but segments within segments within segments. And at some point I'll take you through, or you'll have to trust me on this, all the spreadsheets we went through to look at the market in a whole variety of different facets, not just the normal facets of revenue size and industry and all those things, but to really get into other sort of hard to find brand attributes around style or growth aspirations. So what we did is we positioned the company around this concept of high growth retailers and brands. Right? So even within the concept of retail, who were the highest and fastest growing retailers? And what are those segments that are most sort of applicable to us in our product? And we really focused on those. And what we did is we wired account sets that we spent a long time over directly into our databases on go-to-market. So our sales team and our marketing teams, everyone was aligned around account sets that we knew were highly referenceable. Apparel, footwear, cosmetics, luxury home lifestyle, above certain revenue sizes, within certain segments where individuals knew other individuals. And we went after those people. And it started with one brand that we would win, but then as Michael was saying, that one brand would talk to their friends and say, I made a great choice, I chose this really nice startup, they're doing wonderful things, and words would spread from there. It worked in cities where you would go after a particular brand in a particular city, and once that customer signed on and believed, then the whole city would open up for us. So this concept of sort of positioning with segmentation built in, wiring it right through our operations, and then it permeated everything we did on go-to-market. And that's how we started from where we are, and yeah.
Any questions while we've got Jameis up here? Thanks, Jameis.
You're welcome.
Because we're in a quiet period, having just gone public, we can't talk about the results of Demandware and everything else, but you can go and look it up under the symbol of DWRE on NYSE now. But thank you, Jameis, for covering that. I will just tell you that, in my opinion, sitting on the board there from the earliest days in which we tried to figure this out, it was the segmentation that was critical to the early traction of the company and the repeatable success. Okay. With that, we've covered a couple of the strategic items in marketing, and what I want to do is try to take you into some tactical pieces, because Ultimately, when you try to get your first customers, all the strategy in the world isn't going to count if you can't execute and engage your customers correctly. So in this section, I'm going to give you a simple framework to think through, and that is how you might think about the sales and marketing cycle, or some people would say the marketing and sales cycle. Depends on which side you sit and which may come first. We certainly debate that a lot at Unidesk. But it's somewhere along the lines of these 5 or 6 things that you're going to encounter. How does your customer find you? Where do they get awareness of you? How do they get interest in you? How do they get understanding of what your offering is, your value prop is? How do they engage you? And then how do they trial that solution? And ultimately, how do they buy it? Now, I'm not saying that these are the steps. I'm just saying to you, you will craft some of your own steps. And in fact, in the workshop tonight, to get you thinking about this, I'm going to ask you to just think of what are your steps. Can you, for example, just put up an advert and expect everybody to come and find you and buy your product? I doubt it. But somewhere in between, these various different approaches, you're going to have a set of steps that will define your cycle. But I want to connect it right away to something we've talked about, targeting and segmenting, and give you yet another way to include a notion of segmenting down even one further level. So we've talked about targets and segments. I'm now going to encourage you to learn about actors. Some people talk about these as personas or personifying things. I don't care about the language. But the reason I choose actors is as follows. Throughout the sales cycle and marketing cycle, I find one of the biggest problems startups miss is that the actors change throughout what I call the scenes. That's why I use the term actors. In other words, at the top of this funnel, in early markets, you'll often be selling to a very visionary buyer, somebody who can actually imagine in their own vision what this unique piece of technology, the breakthrough that you bring, is going to do for their business. Those people are very different than at the bottom of the cycle, the guy who signs off on the purchase order. Trust me, they're very rarely the same person, unless you're selling to a consumer, and it's all rolled into one. But in B2C and in large organizations, there are many actors as you move through the scenes in your sales cycle. You'll typically deal with technocrats who are very focused on, for example, how this technically fits. You'll deal with operators who are going to be responsible for actually running your solution. You'll deal with influencers who feel like politically, for one reason or another, they need to be involved in it. You'll ultimately deal with economic buyers who have, obviously, the budget and then authority in the decision maker to give the green light to it. And these are just some of the actors, and they're just some of the examples I can think of. The point to take into account here is when you think about engaging in your marketplace and segmenting, try and figure out who the actors are, try and get to actually identify all their personalities and all their traits, and think about how you will meet their needs throughout the buying cycle. Because the needs will be totally different in this kind of a situation selling to a visionary than they will, as I said, trying to get sign-off right at the end. So at each step of the way, think about the scene you're in and the actors you're trying to deal with, and put their personality traits in your mind as to how you meet their needs. The next concept I want to introduce to you is the notion of driving startup marketing and sales. So I often hear what I would describe as the sort of enthusiast in an entrepreneur saying, oh yeah, I know how I'm going to drive the marketing and sales through from start to finish. Well, obviously, there are people who've learned this discipline. For those of you who haven't had that experience, I'm going to try to give you a sense of it with that whole image of driving. So first of all, there are some things you control. And I would give you the first idea here of, in a car, controlling the gear. You do control the gear. You control how to get from neutral to overdrive with the marketing tools and the sales approaches that you take. That's the good news. The bad news is you do not control the accelerator, the brake, or the clutch. And for those of you who've engaged in the market at large with large customers, you'll probably appreciate this very well. So what are the accelerator, brake, and clutch, and what are the gears? Let's start with what you do control. Well, first of all, gears, as I said, are really the sales and marketing tools that you might use. You'll find this on the website if you don't want to read it. I'm just going to walk you through it. But I use this analogy because I often hear people say, oh, we don't need to do awareness and interest. We can just get people trialing this thing right away. If people don't know what you stand for, they're not going to try something. And it's very much like a gear in a car. You can't shift from 1 to 5. It's just not going to work. You're going to have to figure out those steps. Don't try and skip them, is my first piece of advice. The second thing is, just like if you stay in a gear too long in a car and you over-rev the engine, you're going to get it overheated. The same is true with a customer. If you keep trying to sell a customer over and over and over in the same stage, you're going to get them frustrated. And I'm amazed how many times I see startups saying, oh, but I've got the best trial here and the best brochure here and the best offer here. And all they're doing is in the same stage of the sales cycle. They're not moving the car forward. They're not moving the customer forward in the sales cycle. You've got to find ways, as you move the gears, as you use those tools, to move the customer from stage to stage. And then, very importantly in this thing, the customer will put the clutch in. Trust me. And that will be the moment at which you go, hey, we've lost control. And it'll be because you haven't identified something in their motivations to move from one step to the other. And that's when you've got to find a new gear, a new marketing or sales tool to move them to the next stage. So, what does the customer control, and how do you help them? As I said, they control the accelerator, the brake, and the clutch. The accelerator, from the customer's viewpoint, is how they actually are motivated from one step to the other. So think about this as things we've talked about in the past. If you give them a really slippery product, something that's really simple, lightweight, easy to install, and I'll take you through those attributes again later, that they can try for themselves in a self-service fashion, that's going to accelerate their process of moving from trial to purchase. Similarly, what's going to stop them? What's going to be the brake? Well, if they really don't understand what your solution does, and think about the actors that I was talking about, not just the technocrat, but the guy who's going to operate this thing, and then the guy who's actually got to justify it. They don't know, for example, how it's competitively positioned, as we talked about, or they don't know, for example, how it's priced and how they'll consume it. They're not going to be able to engage with you and get through this whole process. My single best piece of advice here is listen. Actually, actively listen. The more you can engage with your sales team, if you're in marketing, or actually for anybody in the organization, maybe sit in the cube, for example, or the guy who's doing the dialing, smiling and dialing to engage those customers, to dissect all the sales objectives, everything that might come up as a break in your sales cycle, the more you're likely to be successful figuring out how to move the customers from stage to stage. And it's actually the best possible food for the company, is to hear what stops you, what are all the breaks. And then lastly, listen for the clutch. When the customer doesn't know what to do, it's not their fault. When they've engaged the clutch, you have a problem. When the sales cycle stalls, and it will do over and over again, it's your issue to figure out, well, why did it stall? What is it that they're looking for? What's the next tool they need to move them to the next step? And that's really, in many instances, inertia and risk of you just being a startup. So even if you've got a great solution, because you're unknown, you're working against the challenge of being something that is a risk to many customers. So I talked about this concept before in the early stages of these seminars, and that is this notion of customers getting gain and pain. And we wanted to maximize their gain and reduce their pain in the sales cycle. It applies exactly to this model. So I'm just going to connect the dots for you, for those of you who saw it. What you've got here is a series of gears that you can apply to help the customer get their gain. The earlier that you can show them revenue, cost savings, time savings, or people, or competitive advantage in many instances for early markets is very key, or improvements in the reputation, the more likely you are to get them to move from stage to stage. So I try to move what I call instant validation as high as possible. Instant, for example, gratification, if you're giving them something and an offer, and as early as possible into the sales cycle. On the other side of this, all the pain the customer experiences trying to work with you, trying to find you in a marketplace, the sort of awareness piece, trying to try engaging with you and try your product. Those are all limiters. They're all brakes in the process. If you make it difficult for them to buy you because your pricing's complicated, or if your packaging's difficult, or your license is just difficult to work through, these are all things that will slow your sales cycle down. If your implementation is too complex, or deploying you hasn't been thought about, all this will slow down your sales cycle. So you're trying to reduce the brakes and obviously accelerate the gain. And as I said, what the clutch is in this case is something you've got to understand. A startup is a risky proposition, so there's always inertia to move against the startup. And people will look at things like switching costs and what is the alternative, which, by the way, is always do nothing. And good enough, in many instances, good enough. If you don't give them a reason to change something, they will just go with whatever is good enough. And so you've got to think about each of these things, the way we talked about them in the gain-pain ratio, during your sales cycle at each stage. And if you're finding customers engage the clutch and you're not moving, go try find a new gear. Go try to see what you could take off, get them to take their foot off the clutch and release the brake, and you'll find it'll probably be something to do with try a different pricing model, or try a different deployment model, or try a different packaging model. But don't do nothing. That's the worst thing. Don't assume it's the customer's fault. It's always yours. Now, because it takes a lot to move somebody from the top of that funnel to the bottom of the funnel, this is another of my favorite startup secrets, which again, I find amazingly is overlooked, which is qualify early and often. There's no such thing as overqualification in my book. You'd be amazed how many times people are so excited because they got 20 customers to, well, actually, let's be more realistic. They got 500 customers to a webinar. Yes! Does that mean we're doing great? I don't know. I honestly don't. If all 500 of them, when you qualify them, don't have the same need or pain as the solution that you're offering, you did nothing other than basically just waste time and money at that point to broadcast to people who can't engage with you. So qualify often and early in what is it that you're actually able to offer the customers you're talking to, and create a way to save all the time and resources that are going to go through the rest of the cycle. Now, things do change, so I also encourage you to create lead nurturing programs. So in other words, somebody might come into the funnel unaware that they have a need to engage with you. They may not know that they, for example, need desktop virtualization in the case of Unidesk and the management of that. But over time, as they deploy their desktops in a virtual way, they might realize, oh my God, this is really difficult. We have to add these applications and customize for the users. We really need management. So if you kept them along the way, nurtured with education, you can often find that you can move them down the track. So 2 simple things. There'll be more on this on my blog when I get time. Marketing qualifiers are exactly what we just talked through. Do they fit the segment that you've defined? If they don't waste time on them. Even though it'll be very tempting, because you've got this very narrowly defined segment, and now you get loads of interest that's outside of it. It'd be really tempting to go and say, oh, well, it's so close. Why don't we just try this one? Don't do it. Because it's going to take you off message. It's going to take you off point. It's going to take your R&D the wrong traction, and the next thing you know, you'll disperse your energy. And you won't get that referenceability and repeatability we talked about. Sales is actually easier. There's all sorts of sales programs. I happen to grow up with one called Manact, which is qualify whether you've got somebody who's got the money, the authority, the need, the ability to do this, that you can compete against, and in some timescales that are reasonable to you, which in a startup is usually short timescales. So if somebody doesn't have all those things in Manact, they probably shouldn't be in the funnel. And that allows you to save that resource, not just once for that customer, then more importantly, again, to reapply it to another customer. So there's an opportunity cost if you don't do this. So bottom line is qualify early and often. Now again, for those of you who were here when we talked about the business model, we talked about core, and we talked about multipliers and levers. I'm going to tie that to this as well. All the multipliers actually help you drive faster. They are things like how you do tiered pricing, whether you come up with a freemium model, how you use your channel, and slippery products again, so I will talk about that. All of those things will accelerate your sales cycle if you can get them right. On the other side of things, you can reduce your breaks with all the levers we talked about in that session. Using the web, using inside sales to reduce the cost of sales. Obviously, if you're only selling a freemium product, you don't want 3 people involved in it, an expensive outside sales guy and an SE or so forth to do it. And then referencing and through segmentation, getting viral, of course, if you're doing B2C, is an incredible way to reduce friction, get the brakes off. And then some of the things we will talk about today will be whole product. And on my website, I've put up a special post on services because it's a significant area where, actually, believe it or not, services can really help reduce the cycle time in the sales cycle. So for those of you who want to go back and look at this, the business model section is up on the site, and it'll remind you of all the core and levers. But the point is it flows right into this exact same approach to how to improve the sales cycle. So road test. We talked about driving. What I'm going to encourage you to do, for example, tonight, is when you've got your sales cycle worked out, is just road test it. Just continuously iterate around it. See how you can reduce the brakes and let the clutch out by taking time, people, and resources out during the process. See how you can accelerate in gear via automation in that process. The more you can automate the sales cycle, all the touch points, the more you can take out people dependency and make it self-service for the customer to engage you from step to step, the faster it's going to go. And ultimately, if you engage those levers, like distilling every essence of what moves the customer from one piece to another, and doing it in a way that's very repeatable, things like videos and podcasts now on the web make it easy for you to educate people, to move them from awareness to understanding. Or, if they're trying to help themselves in a technical sense, put up things like self-service portals or knowledge bases or on-the-web configurators. All this stuff is a way to make your process more repeatable, more scalable, and to take the friction out of it, engaging the levers. In the end, multipliers also come into play like this. If you get this working for you, even if you sell up front a very low-cost product or a freemium version, then you can obviously, with Russian doll packaging, which some of you remember we talked about, you can upsell it. You can have different versions of it. And so working around your core, you'll find your value prop also can play very strongly into the sales cycle. Now, one concept I keep referring to over and over again, for those of you who weren't here, is this notion of slippery products. So I'm just going to run through it for those of you who didn't see it before. Slippery products are an example of how, believe it or not, R&D actually drives marketing and sales. So you often hear that, oh, R&D and sales, they don't get along. Actually, they can get along famously well. Now, I would say it's still sales' responsibility to answer objections and to pick the right segment. I was in a board meeting just this morning, actually. I won't say who, but somebody in the audience knows, where this exact thing came up. You know, you've obviously got to target the right segment and be selling it in the right way. But once you're doing that, R&D can make a big difference if they make the product simple, low to initial cost, easy to install, where value is proven really quickly up front, and where it plays well with whatever it's got to integrate with, it's easy to use, where the ROI is obvious. And it's a why not customers would want to do this rather than a why would they want to do it. And the only last thing I'm going to introduce here that we didn't talk about before is the notion of whole product. I'm going to get James to come up and talk about it. So whole product is something Geoffrey Moore explains very well. And rather than cover it in tremendous detail, I'll simplify it and just tell you that there are several ways in which your value proposition has to meet the need that you've set out. But if it only meets a part of the need, it's not a whole product. And so the notion of a whole product is that you have the entire solution to meet whatever your value proposition is to the customer. By way of segue, this is an example of self-service portal that Symantec uses in their sales and support. And it's an example of automation that literally enables Symantec to scale. In fact, specifically, they've served 802,000 articles in self-service. And that has been provided not by Symantec, but by nearly 250,000 users that Symantec doesn't pay to actually solve those problems. So that's an example of something working in a very self-service, automated, scalable way. Happens to have been built by our company Acquia as a portal. But the point here is it's an example of what I was looking for earlier. Something that really reduces the friction, makes a very scalable approach. Now the Demandware case study. Here, James, I encouraged to give this slide himself, but he's too modest, so I'll just let him explain the solution. James actually, and Zach, who's here tonight, came up with an approach to creating a whole product they called the Link program. Turns out e-commerce is a very complex solution from end to end. There are lots of things people want to include when they think about e-commerce, everything from ratings and reviews to the back end, fulfillment and delivery. So we couldn't possibly, as a company, deliver everything that anybody envisaged in e-commerce. So the team came up with the Link program, and it not only extends the whole product to a broader solution, but it fulfills the promise with a number of the pieces that were missing from just Demandware. And ultimately, because of the way they did this, it also reduces the cost of integration of those pieces for the customer and reduces the time to deploy. So now you can be immodest, James, and explain how you did that.
Yeah. A marketer that's modest is a rare person. So what I want to do is give a little bit of the backstory behind this as well. So one of the things that, as Michael was saying, e-commerce is part of, there's a whole number of technologies that go into it. So if I want to sell to a consumer over the web, I need an e-commerce platform, I need a way to ship goods, I need a way to track, I need a way to engage a consumer, so many different pieces. And one of the breaks that we would see regularly thrown in a sales cycle was Demandware was a piece of the puzzle, but not the whole puzzle. So invariably, there would be other technologies and folks brought into the sales cycle which would encumber it and slow things down. So that was an issue. increasingly, as you also looked at this, you bring in all these other technologies, it was driving up the cost of integration for the client, which was throwing another break into the process because the bill for the client would go up and therefore it would stall. And we looked at this and we said, all right, so how do we address this? And the program that we came up with was to, rather than us tackle, and we started this way, tackle the integration problem for each and every partner. So we would point-to-point integration with everyone. We said, why don't we turn the model on its head and ask all of our partners to integrate with us? What was different about us is that because we were an on-demand platform, the technology never really changed for us. So an integration that a partner would do to us once was repeatable across every single client. So now what you had was all of these link partners who wanted to plug into Demandware and were pre-building integrations that we made available to our clients at no cost. So now you have lots and lots of partners out there talking about us, plugging into us, giving away those integration assets as a way for them to help get additional clients. And that was driving down our costs of implementation and making it more attractive for us as a provider and a platform. So it hit so many different dimensions of our sales cycles. It increased our reach in a marketplace. It made us much more attractive, so it hit the multiplier side. And then on the lever side, it was taking out all types of costs and structure. And what was beautiful about it is it was stuff that the ecosystem was willing to do on our behalf because they perceived it to be in their interests. So this has been one of those terrific disruptive programs because those who sort of compete with us and sell enterprise software have a very difficult time pursuing this program with the type of repeatability and margin that we're able to do it. So it's been a wonderful program thus far. It's just getting started too. It's going to go on from here.
How many partners do we have now?
A little over 100?
Yeah, about 115.
And how long did it take you, Zach, to get to that number?
So we launched about 2 years ago.
Sorry.
So we launched the program about 2 years ago, April 2010. I'd say the early going, it was one of those very shallow curves, and then all of a sudden, once you start to prove the value, it spiked quickly, and now we're being a lot more selective this time. I think the one thing that I'd add to Jameis as well is because of our disruptive business model of on-demand and shared success, another multiplier is the fact that because all of these technologies are revenue-generating technologies, it actually boosts another aspect up for the customer as they're revenue-generating technologies added quicker, so the time to market's quicker, the time to return is quicker, and with our shared success model, it works even better for us as well. So,
Fantastic, Zach and James. Thank you very much. Oh, sorry, you have a question? Please go ahead.
Question. Can you talk about the clutch with the partners? I'm sure there is clutch with the partners.
With our partner community?
Yeah, with partners, especially in the beginning stage.
Yeah, in the
How
beginning.
have the momentum?
Yeah, in the beginning stage, sort of recruiting, the question was largely what are the clutches that we saw in the partner ecosystem as, and partners are critical for us to actually deploy clients. What are some of the brakes that they would throw on? Is that a fair statement? So initially as a startup, one of the classic challenges that you face with partners is they're not really going to invest a lot of time in you until you're proven. Right? So there's a bit of a chicken and egg in that, particularly if you have a partner strategy that requires partners. The vicious cycle is born. What we found was that through the segmentation we did in our initial go-to-markets, once we had brought on a couple of marquee clients, then it was you had something to go to the partner community with and talk about. That was the primary issue we initially saw. Subsequently, as we started to do things like Link and other things, we were showing them how they could have a much more successful and repeatable business on top of Demandware and contribute to their margins. So they found themselves having an added incentive to work with us. Did that answer your question? Good.
Thanks, Jameis.
Anyone
And
else?
Jameis and Zach will be around to talk later at the workshop, too. So one of the things we did before was we talked about the life cycle of a customer, and I'm just going to try to, again, relate pulling these pieces together. The sales cycle is indeed part of the life cycle. It's the first part of how a customer sees you, where they get awareness of you, interest and understanding of you. And then how they engage and trial you is sort of the early part of obviously how you get to know them. And then ultimately they buy, but that's the beginning. And if you remember, what we talked about was how important it is to try to understand what customers experience when they actually are flying the product or deploying it. And what they're measuring at this point is some of the things that you were just being quizzed on, which is, were they getting competitive advantage, payback, or ROI. And as Zach was saying, the Link program actually helped them get faster payback, faster return on value, because it was giving a more complete solution quicker. So they're always going to be thinking about those things. And my encouragement to you at this point is always to put yourself in the customer's shoes and think about what is it that they're thinking of and what is it that's motivating them to use the accelerator rather than the brake to move through the step in the cycle. Then once you get them to buy, we talked about this notion that we don't want them to just die at that point, a natural cycle. We want them to keep reusing, rebuilding, redeploying, and further expanding their use of you. And so we talked about the cycle of extending the re-engagement, retrial, repurchase, and upselling the customer with more and more value. And that's something that in many models is actually a critical part of how you extend the life cycle value, as I call it, of your customer for a longer and longer period of time. So you'll remember me doing this in the business model. For those of you who didn't see it, again, it's on the website. What I want to do here is just mention something that is often overlooked in the sales cycle, and that is this notion of services. It turns out at the bottom of the sales cycle, when you're engaging a customer and going through trial, one of the best ways to do that is through support and services people, because in many instances, they are not viewed as a threat by the customer. Salespeople, nobody wants to talk to, sad but true. Services people are considered helpful and supportive, and obviously by their very nature, problem solvers. And so they can be incredibly helpful at the end of the sales cycle and also in extending the life cycle. This is a big subject, and I will just tell you, it's a whole subject unto itself that, again, I find very few startups understand. So this is on the website. Here's the URL for it. If you don't want to look it up, just go to mjskok.com. And I've got this double-edged sword of what I call the 7 golden nuggets there for professional services and services, and the 7 deadly sins. And I will just tell you that it's something you should really spend a little bit of time to understand whether it applies to your business. Because if it does, it can make a huge impact. So that's up on the site for another time for you to see. Okay, drilling down one more level to practical notion of what does it actually mean to execute through this sales cycle? It really means, most importantly, measure every step, the time, people, and resources that are involved in it. And at each stage, what you're trying to work out is what's the conversion rate. If you had 100 people at the top, do you end up with 10 at the bottom or 1 at the bottom? And where do people drop out? And if you can measure and manage that all the way through, it'll help you figure out where to apply your resources. So again, graphically, to think about this, if you have a very small segment and you're successful to some extent, you may have a few leads coming in and just 1 customer coming out the bottom. But if you start measuring it and you start measuring the time and resources conversion rate every step, you can figure out how to improve it and break down the cycle into measurable, manageable steps. And I'm not saying thousands, but as many as you can that are measurable and manageable. And ultimately figure out at the bottom, what is the total dollars, time, and resources it takes and conversion rate to get a customer at the bottom. You're going to be in an extremely strong position to figure out how to build your business. So it isn't that complicated. It's a flow diagram, but again, it's just a discipline. What you're looking to do ultimately is widen the funnel and seamlessly link each step with an incentive for a customer to move from step to step in a very easy fashion where there's high conversion rate, so you get a lot of customers out the bottom. And there is a lot of pure, what I would describe as science and measurement that goes into this, not just magic. And I often hear companies say, well, if we spend more, we're going to get more. I wish that were true. The reality is very few sales and marketing processes scale, and you're very unlikely to be able to scale until you figure out what those steps are. So here are at least a couple of startup secrets. The first is reverse engineer this process. Once you know what it costs you to get a customer through it and what your ultimate conversion rate is, if you know, for example, that you get 10 customers out for every 100 in up the top, then if you want to get 100 customers that month, you need 1,000 leads up the top. And you know how much it costs you to do that, so you know how much you're going to have to spend to do it. And if those metrics don't work initially, it doesn't matter. They very rarely will be predictable to start off with. But just the very fact that you're measuring them and you're starting to iterate will help you figure out where, obviously, you are going to be able to scale and whether you're at the point that it's appropriate to scale and to apply more resources. And as a VC, this is where most money gets wasted, is because people don't work through this and they haven't figured out what is the real conversion rate that's going on. And so they spend ahead of their ability to actually convert. So obviously, try to do what I've said, which is measure and manage this, and then work out how to reverse engineer the numbers so you can get your process working for you. Now, I'm very lucky to have a real example coming up with Unidesk, and they're an example of something that has changed dramatically since I started in this business, and that is the web's come along, and it changes nearly everything. It actually makes it possible to measure and manage pretty much everything very easily in a closed-loop fashion, because you can measure every click that somebody takes and every movement they take on every piece of interaction that they do with you on the web. So it's a fabulous tool, and it can help you close the loop. You can also dramatically reduce the cost as a lever in your model, because a lot of the things that you used to have to send people on a plane to do, you can now do as a webinar, or you can package up content as a video or a podcast or whatever it might be. So do it. Take advantage of it. I actually think the challenge for the next generation of startup is to have a touchless sales model, by which I mean a touchless sales and marketing go-to-market model. Now, having said that, I did say it changes nearly everything. One thing that's actually negative about it is that competitors are also one click away. And so you should expect everything to be exposed and be able to compare favorably on the web. You should also realize that when you're doing things like a webinar, just because you've got somebody showing up on a webinar does not mean they're paying attention. In fact, sadly, it often means the exact opposite. It means they're doing 3 other things at once. And in the end, although I'm a great believer in the web and that it can do so much that I've just described, there are some real human factors that come into play. The personal touch, relationships are better done in person, not virtually. And experiential learning, meaning you as a company engaging your real customers face-to-face and experiencing what they go through in the sales cycle and what their gain and what their pain is absolutely vital. There is no substitute for that. The more you experience that, the better you'll figure out what to do even on the web. So last startup secret then on this section is create this closed loop. Create it in a way that with the web, all of the resources and time and dollars that you put into this are actually measured all the way through. And so ultimately, when you know what your conversion rate is and when you're figuring out what it is that drives this cycle, you can do it in a touchless model as much as possible via the web. And you can drive people without you having to get somebody to pick up the phone or go visit them, from awareness to interest to understanding, with things like podcasts and videos and training and materials and self-service portals when they're getting into engagement, with downloadable trials, with documentation that's wrapped around it, etc. Because there's an enormous amount you can do here to actually make this a closed loop now using the web. The only thing that I want to caution you on is that, again, there's a tremendous amount of excitement now around this notion of inbound marketing. We're huge believers in it. We have whole investments in it in companies like Acquia that are making this possible. Inbound works for a certain class of sales. And I'm not going to pick the numbers here, I'm just giving you a sense of it. If you've got low-cost selling from 0 to, say, 50, even 100,000, and we've got companies that go beyond that. Active Endpoints is selling $250,000 deals over the web without outside sales, with inbound marketing. So these are not absolutes. Then that's great. Inbound works great. But at some point, you will almost invariably find that you need outbound. If you're going to build those customer relationships, you're going to have long-term, bigger account engagements that generate millions of dollars. I wouldn't try to press this too far. I'd be careful to recognize where that switchover point is. It may never exist in your model, in which case, congratulations, you've cracked that touchless model that I'm going after. And I think there are going to be companies that do that. But don't push it so hard as to forget that actually it's perfectly appropriate to have an and model, to have a hybrid model. And in fact, that some of the best companies I see now are doing exactly that. They find exactly the right point to engage on outbound from inbound. So with that, I'm going to introduce you to one of them, Unidesk. Tom, welcome, and please come and join us and share with us how Unidesk has cracked the code and done some of the early guerrilla marketing.
Great.
By the way, I
Thanks,
did
Michael.
not do this to Tom.
Yeah, he didn't kick me. I'll get up here as fast as my torn meniscus will allow me to. Yeah, Nike, wearing Nikes when I did this, yes. So Michael asked me to share some concrete examples of guerrilla marketing. I'm probably a good choice because Unidesk is my 5th startup. So like you, I'm used to having very limited budget to engage in marketing. So let's get started, see if that works. So your goal should be really to spend, as Michael said, you don't want to be wasting VC money, Michael's money in my case, on testing what works. Guerrilla marketing is a great way to experiment, and if you're measuring, to refine your strategy without spending a lot of money. So whether you're selling desktop virtualization software like Unidesk is or something else, some of these examples I'm going to show you can really be applied to whatever business you're starting. And as I look back, Unidesk is almost 4 years old now, and we've really applied guerrilla marketing and in social media and web marketing since the inception of the company. So back about 4 years ago, we didn't have a product. We had an idea from our founder. So we were at the requirements phase, and so our goal really was to make sure we built the right product. So how do you get feedback from the market to ensure you're going to build the right product? Well, we came up with the idea to use surveys, and we talked a bit about brand. We had our CTO and founder, Chris Midgley, innovation, well known for innovation. We kind of try to capture his essence in the emails that we sent out to the low-cost list that we acquired. And basically we said, look, I'm Chris Midgley. I have nothing to sell you. I'm just looking to get your ideas on how to refine an idea I have to make desktop management really transform the way desktops are managed. And all I want to do is get some of your thoughts and ideas. And it was amazing that just coming up front with that and saying, I've got no product to sell, we got about 75 responses, and we had open form questions where people were writing almost books, pages and pages of their challenges around desktops and sharing what they wanted to see in an innovative technology. So we use something low cost, SurveyMonkey, it's still out there today, other online survey tools. We leveraged our founder's appeal to kind of get that feedback and really understand what the right product was to build. So that was in our requirements phase. Next was pre-launch. So it took us a while to build the product, actually longer than we had anticipated. The good news was we didn't wait to start blogging and start building our long tail, our search engine optimization, our keywords, until we had launched. We actually started about 1.5 years before we had product. And I can't emphasize that enough. If you've got a compelling personality, if you've got good content, you've got people who like to write, start that right away. Get people coming to your site, share insight, be compelling. You'll get people coming. That'll help build your database. It helps create link tos. It helps you optimize your search for search engine optimization. You'll have the right terms. You'll be drawing people inbound even before you've got product. And that's really what happened with Unidesk. We had a lot of inbound activity even before we had product, which made it much easier for us to get beta customers when we finally did have product. And really all these also map to the stages of the selling process that Michael's already talked about as well. So you see awareness is the stage we're at now. Next is launch. So we finally had product. How do you launch it? In the old days, you hired a PR firm and you did the tour of the press. The press is gone. There is no press anymore. You're the media. Your blog, you can write whatever you want. You've become the new media. And also the influential bloggers that cover your space, they are the new media. So you've got to identify them early and reach out to them. And that's what we did. We actually reached out to the key blogger in the desktop virtualization space. We gave him an exclusive and let him unveil us. And as a result, he talked quite a bit about us in those early days. Of course, you have to have, as Michael said before, a unique differentiated position. You've got to have a compelling brand and idea. So that's how we kind of launched ourselves, was through attacking the bloggers. Now we're in the building pipeline phase. So what kind of guerrilla marketing? And by the way, these are all zero cost, very, very low cost. It doesn't cost really anything other than your time to do these kinds of things. So next was how do we build pipeline? How do we educate prospects that Unidesk has something that's very, very different than anything else that's on the market? And so what we did was we have, again, video editing software. We built videos. Our product demos very nicely. It's almost Apple-esque in the way it looks and feels to the end user. So we leveraged that by taking videos as much as we could and having Chris, who you see there on the bottom left, our chief solution architect, another compelling personality, get up and talk about Unidesk and show the product. And we landed those on YouTube, we put them on LinkedIn, we tweeted, we blogged, we put them everywhere. And again, that drove more inbound traffic to our site and really helped with understanding how Unidesk was new and different in the market. You've got to have strong evangelists and you've got to have crisp scripts. You can't get on there and do 35-minute videos. You've got to be crisp. We had 2-minute shorts, we had 4 or 5-minute longer versions. Our longest version is about 15 minutes, and that's got to be the end. So now we're in the customer acquisition phase. Again, still trying to focus on being low cost. And the cool thing about Unidesk is that we have very passionate customers who want to tell their story about their success. And Michael already talked about how important it is to establish a beachhead, get references, and then have those references tell each other about it. Well, what better way to do that than through webinars where they can get on and broadcast that message to 400 people at a time. And so that's what we've done, especially in the last year. We run webinars every 3 to 4 weeks featuring our customers. They're the stars. We get up there and do a very small product pitch or small demo, but we let them tell their story. And we focus it on verticals. We just did one today on healthcare, and really it was mostly hospitals and clinicians and practices that came on board. So again, if you have passionate customers, you want to get other customers to engage and go to trial with your product, webinars are a very low-cost way to drive that. You're only paying for a GoToMeeting or a WebEx subscription, fairly low cost, and you're spending on vertical response or constant contact or new tools like Acton to do the email marketing. Again, they're all on demand. They're pretty low cost ways of doing this. And the cost per lead becomes very, very low. And then the last phase is when you're in production, you got production customers, how do you get more sales? How do you get repeat sales of the customers you've already sold to? And so like the example that Michael just showed of Acquia with Symantec, we've also just gone live with our forums. Unidesk is based all on Drupal, the platform by Acquia, and as part of that, one of those plugins is a forum. So our customers can search our website, our blog, our knowledge base, our support, our forums, and the website content itself. And our search engine goes across all those things because we've standardized that on that platform. And now with our forums, we're pretty much opening them up to anybody that wants to come on, and they can see the customer dialogue that's happening with Unidesk. We put it online, about a week ago? We already have 215 posts with almost 100 replies on some of these things. So they see how dynamic our community is. It gives the customers confidence that, gee, if I go with Unidesk, I'm going to be part of this growing community. So again, all that requires is you've already got the platform, you got to have active customers who are going to participate in that, you've got to moderate the forum yourself, so it's more of your time. And then at the end of this all is measure everything. Everything you do, you got to refine it, you got to measure it. So we've got spreadsheets, we track everything we do to refine that funnel and make sure that as we're experimenting, we're always improving our processes.
Thank you very much. It was a great example. In many ways, Unidesk has been a great model of this because they've been extraordinarily effective. They're probably one of the very few companies that has always underspent overall versus their original plan. And I think it's in large part to the way in which the team has been so clear about from day one how they would manage and measure everything in their marketing. So congrats to you guys. The last thing I'm going to talk about is channel, and I'm pretty much going to hand this right off to, again, Brian in this case at Unidesk. And I will tell you again, we only have so much time, and you've already been generous with it tonight to cover things. So I would simply say it's a whole subject unto itself. There are many ways to think about channel, from resellers to OEMs to strategic partners. Again, if there's interest, I'll try to cover these things on the blog or in future workshops. But one of the things I would encourage you as a startup to immediately distinguish between is when you think about channel, because it's the thing I clearly hear people forget, is there are 3 different ways in fundamental terms that a channel works with you. It either sells with you, so in other words, assisted selling, or you sell through it, or they sell for you. And very few people spend enough time understanding what is the dynamic you're looking for from your channel. So just to start off with, think about those 3 things, and then what I'm going to do is introduce Brian here to come on up and talk to you about their example of how they built their channel model, because I think it's more interesting to hear a live case study.
To support my brother Tom, I'll limp too. So, I don't have to do that. Excellent, thanks Michael. Quick question, what does the channel care most about? What's most important to them? It's been said a few times already. What do they care about? Wild guess, anybody? James said it. What their customers care about. Simple. What their customer cares about is what the channel wants to spend time on. Now the challenge is when you're first launching and you don't have customer evidence and you want to go recruit a channel, not easy to do. Can be done. We'll talk a little bit about how we did it, but not easy to do. I think James actually used the chicken and egg analogy. It's sort of the one that comes to mind most often. One of the reasons why, there were 2 reasons why we went to channel model when we launched. One is that there are 5 decisions that a customer needs to make either before they purchase Unidesk or as they purchase Unidesk. And 2, one of the key elements of that IT infrastructure that they're making decisions on is a product that's provided from a little company called VMware. And what we wanted to do is target and identify those customers and market specifically to them. So with that in mind, we naturally identified the top VMware partners that sold that product into the segments that we cared most about. I'll speak broadly and then more specifically. So state and local government, higher education. But within those segments, we cared most about faculty and staff and knowledge workers. Those are the areas that we could be disruptive for anybody that was considering making an investment in desktop virtualization. So once we compiled that list, we refined it further, and we identified the partners that we thought would take a chance on an early, on a disruptive technology. So you wouldn't go after the larger sort of partners that had national footprints, that had longer onboarding processes. You could get to those later. Think of those as the laggards as it relates to the channel. We wanted the early adopters. We wanted the regional boutique partners that prided themselves on bringing value to their customers by introducing new technology. So that's something that we did. The key is then refine and focus further. I think focus has been used a few times here tonight. Identify the person that the sales team listens to in that partner and target that individual. And that was typically the trusted advisor to the sales team. That would be, in our case, it was a technical architect. I was laughing actually when Jameis, you were talking about spreadsheets in the early days. It's spreadsheets everywhere if you came by theCUBE. It was, listing of all the partners, ranking them, identifying who we wanted to target, how we wanted to message to them, how they performed with VMware, what our unique value was going to be. You needed to be crisp. You had to have your buyer personas baked. All of those things needed to be aligned. So all the things we've been talking about here tonight. Once we gained the endorsement of the lead technical architect, we then had the permission to engage the sellers. What I mean by that is the sellers wouldn't pay attention to you unless you had that endorsement. And our goal was to intercept partner-led sales opportunities and interject Unidesk. Okay? So whether that's going back to customers they had sold to previously, or again, get involved with the ones that they had in flight. And frankly speaking, Adam, I loved what you were talking about from a brand perspective. Our sort of bold statement to the channel is we will not let your customers fail. So I know you're taking a chance, but we will provide such amazing customer support to your customers. We will do all the work. We will do all the selling. We will do all the support as they work through the free pilot stage, and we will make them amazingly successful, and they are going to be calling you to tell about that amazing experience that they had, and then we will further scale our footprint with that partner. And that's the way we trained and why we completed training and enablement. You have the on-demand tools, which you can try to get your partners to take advantage of, but until they experience a win with you, it's very difficult for you to get time with them. And if you're getting time with the channel when you don't have customer evidence, you're probably engaged with the wrong partner, okay, if they have that kind of time and capacity. The other important point is it's all about evidence. I think Tom sort of captured that. We have been very, very fortunate to have an incredibly passionate group of customers. And so when it comes time to truly scaling your channel, so now you're starting to expand and engage some of the larger channel partners, the way that we engage these folks is so members of my team will call in and they will try to activate or recruit a channel partner. We'll do the best we can with the messaging, but in some cases they don't want to hear it. The follow-up discussion, or if we are taking a next step with them, we will typically invite one of our customers, it's not even one of their customers, but one of our customers to that call, and they will tell the same story we've been telling, but for whatever reason, the partner listens. So if you can get customers to deliver your message on your behalf to your channel partners or however you go to market, right, in whatever capacity, it'll be amazingly successful. It's all about accelerating the activity with the partners, and the best way to do that is certainly with your customers. We're maniacal about measurement. And frankly, the channel, there's no easy way to manage, no easy way to score it. You end up in a spreadsheet inevitably. But for us at a very high level, we kind of categorize partners as A and B. A's are the ones that are strategic, that we could count on for, say, 60 to 70% of our revenue, however you measure revenues or number of new customers or number of seats sold. But these are the organizations that we were locking in with and we were going to make a strategic commitment to, and that we would expect the same from that channel partner. The other key piece I was sort of noticing here that's actually not listed is then when you think you've measured enough, go a level deeper and ask yourself, when you look at your top channel partners, and you might be impressed by a national partner like a Presidio or Dell or their contribution, and maybe they're in the top 5 for you, and then you have sort of regional boutique partners that are contributing less. But ask yourself, what % of the mind share do you have from that particular organization? Is all your success coming from one office or one set of reps, or are there opportunities for you to scale? So you want to continue to measure down to the unique individual level as opposed to just at the partner account level. And lastly, repeat the cycle. I think just in closing here, the piece that you may want to keep in mind, our channel is not very good at the social media marketing aspects of things. They're very good at field-based marketing, not good at nurturing. So they've effectively outsourced that to us. So as much as you can, you want to get them to share their database, their customer list, anything, and then establish a trusted enough relationship that they'll let you nurture them, and then you can notify them based on experience on the site and so forth.
Fantastic. Thank you very much.
Sure.
I'll say that again. Very few people who do it as well as Brian does. And he's created a wonderful set of metrics around how to make the channel work for Unidesk. But he's also done it multiple times before. So those of you who get a chance in the workshop, which we're happily just about at, can engage him and just get some sense of that. But the channel is a science too. So I just want to say thank you very much to our presenters, who I think done a fantastic job helping you get a sense of this. But also just recap on where we started out. This is a big subject, and you've been very patient to listen through just a few of the things that we wanted to give you as a sense of where you might start. Brand positioning, direct versus channel, how you'd segment, how you'd think about the personas and even the actors through these scenes. And I want to give you one last piece here, which is, while you've heard lots of people say, you know, if you measure all this and you're very results-oriented and you execute well, you'll do great things. It's also true that Rome was not built in a day, and this is true of how your sales and marketing will play out too. Be patient with yourself. It is really worth being results-oriented. It's really worth figuring out how to measure everything, and obviously it depends on execution, but it takes time. And in fact, you saw me put this up before in the process of building a business. This is an iterative process. You need to do a lot of listening, all the way through the sales cycle, understanding those objections, do a lot of learning from your customers of what's going on. Also be prepared to lead, because customers will not tell you what they need from step to step. That's your leadership, that's your vision and so forth. Iterate around things like your product and your proposition, or if you like the term, pivot around it. And be clear that this also does engage both of the things that we've talked about tonight, business model that we talked about before, and go to market as well as value prop even. So to summarize, before we start the workshop, go-to-market is both strategic and tactical. We've covered a bit of both. I'd encourage you to start off with, on positioning, just looking for a unique white space when you break into the groups. Then pick a target and segment around the customer needs, and then manage your brand from the start. And finally, think about driving. You heard all the metaphors around that, using accelerators, brake, clutch, etc. Your marketing and sales cycle, and figuring out how you can do that in an iterative process on a patient basis. So thank you all very much for being so patient.